Greetings, everyone. This is Peg Brady at NOAA Fisheries in Silver Spring, Maryland. Welcome to the Ecosystem-Based Management, Ecosystem-Based Fishery Management monthly seminar series. We hold these on the second Wednesday of each month. And just an FYI, next month we're taking a bit of a vacation, and we'll pick up on September 11th with Mike Fogarty from our Northeast Fishery Science Center, who will be speaking. So just make a note that next month we will not be having a speaker. I also just want to make a note that we were very happy to hear last week that our presenter from last month, June, Elizabeth Seiden, received a early career award for scientists and engineers. So it's a very exciting announcement to hear that she was one of the recipients nationally selected for the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. So congratulations to Elizabeth and her work that she's done in the Alaska region. Today we are joined by Morgan Kilgour, who will be presenting from Sacramento, California. Morgan is currently with the Delta Stewardship Council Science Program based in Sacramento and has just joined them in the last year. And she recently left the Gulf Council, where she was a senior lead fisheries biologist with the Gulf Fisheries Management Council. This is one of our first speakers to join us from our partners in the business of fisheries management, and we're very happy to have Morgan provide her insights based on her experiences both with the Gulf Fisheries Management Council as well as her current work that's underway right now with the Delta Stewardship Council. So welcome, Morgan, to the series, and we look forward to your presentation. We'll be taking questions from the audience here in Silver Spring as well as online, and we'll have Morgan address those questions when she completes her presentation. So again, thanks to everyone for joining today, and we'll turn it over to you now, Morgan.
Thank you very much. So thank you for the nice introduction. I was a fishery biologist with the Gulf Council, so I'm going to focus a lot of my my talk on my experience there and how ecosystem management is actually already applied in the Gulf, though it's not termed that. But also I wanted to kind of give a second view of how ecosystem management is conducted in the Delta, in the California Delta, which is completely different. Moving from the South to California, of course, attitudes and values change a lot, and it's just interesting to see the two different approaches. So I need to preface this by saying that these are my own opinions, and they don't reflect necessarily those of the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council or the Delta Stewardship Council Science Program. These are just my own observations. I'm happy to take any questions and elaborate further on anything that I discuss here. And I think it's hard to do as the presentation is in progress, but if you're able to get a question in while I'm on a slide, then feel free. I don't mind being interrupted at all. So just this is that infographic that I'm sure we're all very familiar with, and that ecosystem-based management incorporates a whole bunch of different scientific advice that's needed, including fisheries, development, energy, ecotourism, etc. And it goes down to ecosystem-based fisheries management, which is the development of a fishery ecosystem plan. And ecosystem approaches to fisheries management look at a single species in its environment, including climate, habitat, and predators. And where many people think most councils are is at the single species management, but I want to kind of explain how most councils are already doing ecosystem approaches to fisheries management because they're mandated by the Magnuson-Stevens Act to integrate ecosystem considerations into fishery conservation and management actions. They're also councils are also required to minimize impacts of fishing on various ecosystem components. For example, in the Gulf of Mexico, they have a coral fishery management plan, which is essentially they are managing corals to minimize fishing impacts on those corals. They are not a harvested resource, but they are an important habitat, and so the council has chosen to manage corals in the form of habitat areas of particular concern and allowing no take of stony and black corals in the Gulf of Mexico. The Magnuson-Stevens Act also specifically to ecosystem management authorizes NOAA fisheries to provide technical advice and assistance to the councils, but it doesn't require that councils develop fishery ecosystem plans nor practice ecosystem-based management. It only requires that ecosystem considerations are taken into account when developing management actions. So many of the councils are working on fishery ecosystem plans, which is kind of confusing because an ecosystem plan is not a prescriptive plan. It doesn't require any management action by the council unless the council specifically puts that in there. There are several different approaches to what should be included in an ecosystem plan, and it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't have management teeth unless the councils choose to put those management teeth in. For example, I believe that Pacific Fishery Management Council requires that every year they have a state of the ecosystem portion of their council meeting to see where is the ecosystem this year, and they may even use that to determine what quota is for different fisheries. But an ecosystem plan in itself is basically a recipe book for what should the council consider when taking management action. So when I got to the Gulf Council in 2013, I was assigned to be the ecosystem staff member. Prior to me arriving at the Gulf Council, there was a tremendous push to develop some type of ecosystem-based management plan. There were ecosystem workshops. There were 9 throughout the Gulf of Mexico from 2004 to 2010. There was an attitudes and values survey that was conducted nationally, and 4 councils participated. There were several ecosystem modeling workshops, and the Gulf Council has always commented on ecosystem-related NIMS products and policies when asked to and when given enough time. The Council has also incorporated red tide events and impacts into reef fish stock assessments. And from 2005 to 2015, and once again in 2018 to the present, the Council had a special scientific and statistical committee devoted to ecosystem science. The Gulf Council is the only council that has not only a standing SSC, but several specialized SSCs on any given topics. For example, reef fish, coral, shrimp, spiny lobster, and ecosystem. I wanted to highlight that those ecosystem workshops throughout the Gulf seemed like a great idea, but they were very poorly attended. Most of them had maybe 2 or 3 participants outside of the council staff. The modeling workshops were also presented to the council, but sometimes the models didn't make sense. And I'll get into that a little bit later. And when the Ecosystem Scientific and Statistical Committee was originally initiated, it had probably, I can't even remember the number, but it had something between 12 and 15 members on it. And so those meetings are very expensive to run, and when you're not getting much product out of those meetings, it's really hard to justify continuing to have them. Later on, the Gulf Council decided to still continue to have an ecosystem SSC with 3 people, but even then, it was initially titled an ecosystem modeling SSC, and after discussions with staff, they modified it to ecosystem SSC so that it wouldn't focus on just ecosystem modelers, but general, more holistic ecosystem scientists, which might provide more insight into something that can be used for management action. So the previous missteps, which I've touched on, are that the workshops were really poorly attended, so we weren't getting a lot of bang for our buck when the council was hosting these workshops. And the ecosystem approaches that came out of the SSC and that came out of the modeling workshops focused exclusively on projected models, and when the models results didn't seem to be based in reality. One of the examples that was provided to the Gulf Council was that if shrimping were to cease, hardhead catfish would take over the Gulf of Mexico. Well, when you're presenting that to a bunch of managers, that seems pretty far-fetched, and the institutional memory of that particular outcome is what many managers will remember instead of any of the other beneficial models and outcomes from models that were presented. So there seemed to be a real communication barrier between the scientists and the council, specifically the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council, because while the scientific work was very exciting, its application into management action there seemed to be a really big divide there. So since those ecosystem workshops, the council has kind of shifted tack, and and there's also been a lot of effort on the NIMP side on developing ecosystem roadmaps and the regional ecosystem roadmaps, which provided the council an idea of what a fishery ecosystem plan would have in it, which was very beneficial. After having one of our star scientists from the Southeast Fisheries Science Center come and provide the regional ecosystem roadmap, the council discussed it at a later meeting, a formal motion, and made a formal motion to begin work on a fishery ecosystem plan, which is what the council staff absolutely need in order to begin work on something of this magnitude. So if you ever approach a fishery management council staff member and they're not working on something you think is valuable, if his or her council did not make a motion to initiate that work and there's not a lot of direction from upper management to continue that work, then hands are tied for that scientist. And I just want to point that out because it seems like this is a no-brainer, but we're all given our marching orders, and so it's really important that either the council or your upper management really think that this is a project that you need to work on. The Gulf Council also established an ecosystem technical committee, and to the right is the actual charge that's been provided to that ecosystem technical committee. And there's been a much better communication between the council staff and the science center staff and other branches of NOAA that do ecosystem science. For example, the Gulf Council was invited to attend the National IEA conference for the past 2 conferences, which has really helped staff understand what ecosystem science is going around the country and how can that better be incorporated into management actions. And again, we have an amazing staff member, Mandy Karnauskas, with the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, who really reaches out to the council staff to keep ecosystem in the forefront of our brains, and so that she's actively involved in helping develop a fishery ecosystem plan as best she can in her current role. So I finally got the motion from the Gulf Council to develop a fishery ecosystem plan and was offered another opportunity to move to California, which is where I'm originally from. So I wanted to kind of touch on what I've learned moving from the Gulf Council to a state agency in California, and I work for the Delta Stewardship Program science program. A little bit about the Delta. The Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is the largest estuary on the West Coast, and it's been modified beyond recognition. There are so many modifications to the waterways that it would be absolutely impossible for it to go back to its natural state. It's a source of water for 26 million people in California, and it's home to several endangered species, including Delta smelt and winter run Chinook salmon. There's lots of dams all throughout the Delta. Most of these, while they're capable of producing hydropower, most of those dams are really reservoirs for water for those 26 million people. And it's an agricultural hub. Many of the islands that are in the Delta are prone to subsidence, and where we have a problem with non-native species throughout the Delta. So what is going on in the Delta? Well, I should have done this first. The Delta Stewardship Council Science Program was established by the Delta Reform Act in 2009. This Reform Act established the Council, the Science Program, the Delta Protection Commission, the Delta Conservancy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these agencies already existed, but this act in 2009 reaffirmed those agencies. It established the co-equal goals of water supply in a healthy ecosystem, and it required that a Delta plan be established by the Delta Stewardship Council. So, in seeing that, the Delta is managed as a place, and it is managed with ecosystem management, and it has to provide water supply for those 26 million people. So there are several competing interest groups, and including several federal agencies, several state agencies and multiple stakeholder groups who all want different things out of the delta. But I would say as a whole, the delta is pretty much managed under ecosystem-based management, except for when it comes to, and we even have this interagency ecological program, which is most of these federal agencies and state agencies coming together to collaborate and to centralize their data hubs, their research efforts, and management discussions. They also have subdivided it into project working teams focused on specialized portions of the delta, like residential fishes, radio telemetry data, water quality, etc. There are so many project working teams, I couldn't list them all in this talk. And then the scientists in the field have a direct link to managers for setting priorities for research and for data. But because the Delta has so many interconnected multiple agencies, the Delta Science Program is kind of a central hub to get all of these agencies to collaborate for independent science reviews and workshops. And there are multiple management plans that are existing in the Delta for different flows and we have 2 biological opinions for the endangered species of Delta smelts and the winter red Chinook salmon. And so the smelt biological opinions have been written by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the salmon has been written by the National Marine Fisheries Service. And when the Delta Plan was established, these things were all there were several. Excuse me. Let me take a drink of water really quick. The Delta Plan established several criteria that each action needed to take, but all of these criteria that may need to consider the Delta Plan have to be self-certified by the action agency. So the science program really comes together to try and get all of these groups in a room to discuss things and make sure that agencies are talking to each other when they're developing management actions. But one thing that you can see is it's kind of a mess. There are a lot of fingers in the pie, and that there can be a lot of hiccups if the right people aren't involved in discussing these things. And frankly, the currency of all management actions that have to do with water really revolve around Delta smelt and Chinook salmon and how those actions will affect them, because the Endangered Species Act is king when it comes to deciding if an action can occur or not. So my take-homes that I really want ecosystem scientists to understand when it comes to interacting with managers is that it's really important to understand your audience and to talk to the staff that are directly involved with the managers, including the Fishery Management Council staff. Sending the right people to communicate with managers is really important. Many times I saw really brilliant scientists come and present information that fell on flat ears because there was no clear "how is this related to me" message to the council, or it was just the wrong place or the wrong time. It wasn't within the right committee, or it wasn't. There was another pressing issue at the Gulf Council felt like had to be taken care of. So it's really important to work with the council staff to make sure that your message is heard and can be incorporated appropriately. I found that the Ecosystem Scientist Network is diverse, incredibly talented, and has lots of really good ideas, but sometimes those ideas weren't incorporated because the right people weren't contacted. The interagency ecological program here in the Delta has been a really valuable example to me, at least, to see how multiple agencies to come together. They talk all the time, and they talk about the research that they're doing so that everybody seems to know what's going on and who's doing what, so that multiple efforts towards the same goal aren't being made. They're all able to divide their resources a lot better to make sure that that there isn't duplication of effort. And I think I motor-mouthed my way through that pretty quickly. That was my intent. I would rather answer questions than talk your ear off, so I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Morgan. That was a very good presentation, giving us insight from your perspective, both at the Delta Stewardship Council as well as at the Gulf of Mexico Fisheries Council. So what we'll do is we'll open up to questions here in the room, and I'm looking over at Katie to see if we have any questions coming in online? And so far we do not. So we'll stand by here for a little bit and see. Okay. Can you speak up loud so Morgan can hear you here? You might have to come up closer. We have one question here in Silver Spring.
Hi, thank you so much. Michael Abbey. I work in international, mostly doing EAFM work in Southeast Asia. Just wondering, when we were developing curriculum for them to use specific to South and Southeast Asia, one of the challenges that we have is kind of the cult of personality. We have some incredible champions, but it's trying to identify, the champion self-identified, but it's moving from the champion to institutionalization of the ideas of EAFM. Just wondering if you've come across that in your experiences. You have the champion, but how do you translate that energy from one person into kind of an institution? And if you see that in either of your two experiences, or if you have any thoughts on how that transition can happen, should happen, has happened, and any struggles that you've come across, either in personal experiences or anecdotally.
Well, it's a really awesome question, and really it's a challenging one to answer because I think it really depends on your region. So here in California, the Delta Reform Act was an act of the state legislature. So they have in there that ecosystem management must occur, and these are the things that you need to consider. And the Delta Plan has to consider multiple aspects of any action in order to for it to be consistent with the Delta Plan. But in the Gulf of Mexico, there was a major hurdle in that one of the first things that I did when we were really moving full steam ahead was there were several presentations given to the council that just they were awesome presentations, but they kind of fell flat because there wasn't an actionable item associated with those presentations. They were informational. So I had a lot of help in looking through what had the council already done that was an ecosystem approach to fisheries management, and said, you've already done this. This is something that you are doing already. You just haven't called it that. And there was a lot more buy-in when there was understanding that, hey, this is not something that is brand new and is super complicated. It can be really easy to start off with and grow in complication if it has to. Ecosystem management does not have to be complicated, but if it has to, in small steps and small bite-sized chunks, instead of going from feeling like you're managing something just based on size limits to managing something based on the angle of the sun, or which is I'm pulling things out of the air right now, but it doesn't have to be. If you can make it relatable and what you're already doing is this, and it makes it almost a little bit more palatable. That's how I think the council was really able to move forward more quickly than I had anticipated once they were given information of you're already doing it.
Great. Yes. We have another question here in Silver Spring. So introduce yourself.
Hassan Mustafi from Integrated Ocean Observation System here in Silver Spring, and I just noticed one of your slides had some text saying the mission of the ecosystem technical committees and to incorporate ecological interactions into stock assessment. And it strikes me that I don't know if that committee was specifically into ecological, but where is the socioeconomic? Where is the human dimension onto the? I don't know if that was more technical, just specifically for ecological interactions. But sometimes I notice that we always forget about the socioeconomic into the ecosystem approaches. That's striking me every time when I went even to the food agriculture organizations. They told me, well, U.S. is only incorporating ecology but no socioeconomy. I said, well, that's wrong. That's not right. So anyhow, I just noticed that in your experience in the Gulf.
Yeah, Morgan, that's a great question. Socioeconomics.
Right. So that is the socioeconomic factors are a major component of a fishery ecosystem plan. Stock assessments in particular mostly are driven by biological factors and not necessarily socioeconomic factors, but it is something that the Gulf Council in particular is well aware of. I mean, it is the largest recreational fishery, I think, in the country, we have a huge recreational component to our council membership, and you're correct in that that recreational fishery and the commercial fishery have major economic drivers. There's major social differences between the different types of fisheries there are, and they need to be considered in an ecosystem plan. I'm not sure if the technical committee is considering those socioeconomic factors specifically in stock assessments, which help project the amount of take, but it is an important component of an ecosystem plan in the broad scale of things. You're 100% correct.
Great, thanks, Morgan. Any other questions from here? And any online? We have a couple questions coming in now online, and Katie's going to read them to you. And if they are detailed questions, we may ask you to take them offline, but we'll give it a chance.
Okay. Hi, Morgan. First question: what are your suggested next steps needed for developing a fishery ecosystem plan for the Gulf of Mexico, and how would an FEP help the council implement EBM, the ecosystem-based fishery management?
Right. So, and who is so my recommendations and the approach, had I stayed on with the Gulf Council, that I was going to take was the Pacific Fishery Management Council has an excellent fishery ecosystem plan where they have divided it into multiple chapters, going through the history of each of the different fisheries, specific factors that are really important to each fishery, including socioeconomic factors, and basically highlighting the things that really affect the fishery on a daily and long-term scales. So I would have approached the Fishery Ecosystem Plan by kind of modeling it after what the Pacific Council has already done. I'm sorry, what was the next part of your question? I just totally lost my train of thought.
I think that was the whole of the question, was how your suggestions for how you would move forward.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's really no point in reinventing the wheel, especially when someone has done such an excellent job of providing a template for a fishery ecosystem plan. And those ecosystem plans are something that I feel like the Gulf Council should develop, and the Pacific Council, like I said, once a year they review the state of the ecosystem, and that's really something that should be considered every year because it's an ongoing changing animal, and not every year is created equal in terms of environmental and socioeconomic influences.
Okay, thank you. We have another question about outreach to stakeholders outside of the council process itself, including communication to the general public regarding ecosystem status. Do you feel this is important? And do you know of examples where this has been done successfully?
So, I think first you need to get buy-in from your council, but part of that is approaching stakeholder groups about what a fishery ecosystem plan would do. I know in the Gulf, Mandy Karnauskas has had several workshops with fishermen to kind of do what do you think affects this fishery. So she would be somebody that I would reach out to, but I would reach out to basically any of your science center staff to talk to them about what have they done to engage the council and stakeholders. And really, if you're going to have workshops, don't just invite scientists, invite fishermen that are actively engaged in coming to council meetings. I mean, their time is very precious because when they're at a meeting, they don't get paid and they're losing a day on the water, but their input is also pretty insightful most of the time on what they are actually seeing there on day to day. So I would invite people that seem to have an interest, as well as people that's their job is to do ecosystem science.
Okay, thank you.
One more question there?
Yeah, one more question. Norman Johns said, thanks for the slides that lay out the various Delta actors, quite complex, but as you pointed out, the efforts have coordinated actions is very positive. I presume you would include the biannual Delta conference in those efforts?
Yes. the Delta program or the Delta Science program portion, I'm still very new to my role here, so I wanted to touch on how different I found this agency from my previous agency, but it's definitely not all inclusive or comprehensive as far as the Delta Stewardship program goes, because I'm still learning, and these are just observations that I've made of what I've seen here. But I find it very complex and really a great challenge to learn all the nuances of this new system.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, we have one more question from Yvonne, who was one of our earlier speakers. Morgan has mentioned some good starting steps for helping fishery management councils think about FEPs. Tell your council with details from each FMP what they've already done that's considered ecosystem-based management. And then she goes on to discuss some examples. So I appreciate Yvonne's input here. Is there a question at the bottom there? No.
No.
Nope, there's not a specific question, but just a comment on that point that you made, Morgan.
Okay.
Okay, and then I have one question. This is Peg Brady. You talked about the relationship or the tight communications in your current situation at the council, at the Delta Stewardship Council, between the scientists and the managers. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that relationship and the importance of that in terms of these ongoing discussions?
Well, so yeah, I can elaborate a little bit, but like I said, I don't want to misspeak, and I'm still learning a lot of the nuances here. But one particular group that I have been listening in, and I'm not an active participant, but I am a participant, is a group that was developed because of the biological opinions. There were a lot of lawsuits regarding the biological opinions and the different factors that need to be considered and maintained in order to protect Delta smelt and salmon. And so this group is basically made up of managers, stakeholders, and scientists, and they come together every month to discuss certain projects that are ongoing to help inform different management actions. And it's the Collaborative Adaptive Management Team is what it's called. It's CAMP, and basically they all get together and they talk about the state of what the Delta is in response to provisioning water supply and protecting those endangered species. So it's a really good thing. It's a really good place for managers and stakeholders to get together, talk about problems, and try and identify solutions. One of the big things that comes out of that group is they kind of decide on what areas need more research, what does the research tell us in terms of moving forward with management actions, and that's eventually communicated up to the heads of the different management agencies, including federal, state, and stakeholder groups. So it's a really productive group in that they meet quite frequently to discuss ongoing challenges, how those challenges can be addressed through research or through management action, and that's communicated from the bottom up of we need funding for this type of study, and that study will get funded should funds become available, or should funds be available. So but what I also have found in the Delta is there are a whole lot of groups like that. So it's really challenging to try and figure out who's managing what specific action, who's managing the salmon, who's managing the smelt, who's managing how much water is released from each individual dam. All of that those are all different players, and so learning the how to navigate through those channels has been exciting and challenging.
Great, thanks, Morgan. I think we're done with questions in here in Silver Spring and online. Again, Morgan, I really want to thank you for all your efforts in pulling together. Oh, I'm sorry.
We do have one more question.
One more question.
Do you see a role for local knowledge and participation by fishermen and other stakeholders to help add capacity of data collection temporarily and spatially, particularly with respect to environmental ecosystem factors?
So yes, I do see a role because I feel like fishermen are actually out there on the water and they see change a lot sooner. But I also feel like for data to be effective, it needs to be collected in a scientifically rigorous manner. So while I feel like the fishermen are great at providing canary and coal mine without a scientific backing or collaboration with a scientist who knows how to collect data in a statistically rigorous fashion, it's tricky. You don't want to discount somebody who wants to be involved in a process, but you also need to be able to communicate to them how that process can be best aided by a fisherman on the water. So it really takes communicating with whoever wants to help on how they can best help, and also not discounting some of their observations when you're providing information to managers. Sometimes one of the best parts I thought about the Fishery Management Council was that public input was discussed before they took action on anything, and that is part of public input. And there's an avenue on the Gulf Council website for fishermen to provide on the water reflections or on the water observations whenever they're initiating a new stock assessment, so that perhaps those different observations can be incorporated in when they're developing the models for those stock assessments.
Great. Thanks, Morgan. I think we have exhausted all our questions here and online. Again, Morgan, thanks so much. Appreciate your insights, given your two organizational experiences. Very helpful for this community. A reminder to everyone that next month we will take a little bit of a vacation break, come back in September with Mike Fogarty from our Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And also a reminder to let folks know, if you have colleagues that were unable to join us today, that all these are archived on the NOAA library website. All the past presentations and today's will be available probably within a day or so for today's, but June's is up, and if anyone wants to look at Elizabeth's presentation from June, that's available online. So again, thank you again for joining. If you have comments, recommendations, suggestions for future presentations, please let us know. And again, thanks to everyone for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your summer. Thank you. Thank you, Morgan.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.